Let me start this video with a story. Katia was a reporter who came back to her native city of Pagoran when the war broke out, hoping to cover the story and check up on her parents. Unfortunately, she was too late. By the time she arrived, her parents had gone missing and Pagoran itself had crumbled to ruins. Stranded, she found herself teamed up with two men, Bruno and Pavle, to survive the siege. For a week, they stayed together, struggling to eke out a life in a rundown home with no food and no running water. Eventually, a woman came to the door and was desperate for help. Men were threatening her and her daughter, and they needed help boarding up their home for safety. Over Bruno's protestations, Katia went out that night to help strangers in need. One morning, the group met Erica, a young cat burglar looking for shelter. Katia welcomed her in. But just when it felt like their little family was growing, Pavle died getting supplies. That hit the group hard, and even newcomer Erica was saddened by the loss. A few days later, the woman with the daughter returned, this time pleading for someone to stand guard against a group of threatening-looking men she saw outside of her home. And again, Katia stepped up and volunteered, if only to get her mind off of Pavle's death. And again she returned unharmed, proud that she would not let this war break her. Later that week, Bruno died. Erica and Katia fell into deep depression and occasionally fought. It fell on Katia to scavenge for supplies, especially after Erica was seriously wounded in a raid on the camp. One night in a supermarket, Katia witnessed a soldier trying to rape a woman looking for some food. As ever, Katia did what she thought was right. But this time she paid for it with her life. The next night, Erica went to the same supermarket to pay her respects. Erica found Katia's diary and brought it back to the camp. Alone and wounded, Erica wouldn't survive many more days. But the diary would eventually make it into Katia's parents' hands and would become a best-selling account of the war. Whew. Not to switch tones too much, but I have to love a game that can generate narratives like that. This War of Mine's approach to narrative generation is kind of interesting. It's one part The Walking Dead and one part The Sims. That is to say, like The Walking Dead, characters come pre-baked with personalities that you can observe by reading their personal bios that get updated as events unfold around them. And like The Walking Dead, a fair bit of the game is scripted. Different scavenging locations have one or two possible events you might encounter. For example, there's a garage where a son is taking care of his sick father and is desperate for medicinal supplies. And the choices in these scripted situations, like The Walking Dead, are state-based. You can trade medical supplies with that family, or you can turn around and ignore them. But like The Sims, there's a strong procedural element at play. Maybe you don't help the father and son because your own party members are sick and you need the medicine for yourself. Maybe you help them because you witnessed some terrible stuff last night and you need to feel good about people again. Maybe you watch aghast as the son pleads for medicine but simply have none to give, and leave them empty-handed wondering if the father will be okay. All of these are valid outcomes of the game, but systems-wise this encounter only really has two outcomes. You give the guy medicine or you don't. What makes this War of Mine special is that it makes the narrative context for why you helped or why you didn't help matter just as much as whether you helped. Suddenly, these binary choices become far more complicated when there are a million selfish reasons to help and a million noble reasons to walk away. The gameplay itself sits somewhere between The Sims and Don't Starve. You manage several civilian survivors of the war in Pagoran. During the day, you build up your camp and try to keep spirits up by feeding people, letting those who had guard or scavenger duty rest up, having conversations with other survivors, and generally expending your resources to stay as healthy and happy as you can. At night, each survivor can do one of three things. They can rest with sleep, they can stand guard to protect the stash, or they can go out and scavenge for more resources. Rest can help sickness and wounds and exhaustion, but you do need to scavenge for supplies, and you never know if you're going to be raided any given night. If one follows Sid Meier's definition of a game as a series of interesting choices, this is the gamiest game of all. Even deciding who goes to bed is a big debate about weighing risk and reward. It is at its heart a survival title, and like many of those, you will fail a lot before you win. But where Don't Starve and other survival games are about seeing how far you can go, this War of Mine is more about the journey than the destination. It cares about the stories it generates more than something as trivial as winning. Dwarf Fortress's mantra may be that losing is fun, but I'm not really keen on that saying. First because, fun, but also because it masks a more important lesson on display both there and in this War of Mine. These games don't suggest that the act of losing is itself fun, but that some games create possibility spaces where outcomes that don't result in victory can still result in accepted or satisfactory experiences. So maybe not losing is fun, but losing is valid. It's an embrace of the whole possibility space that I really respect. Where other games pretend that lost states don't really happen, games like this War of Mine insist that not only do they happen, they need to be respected. To not do so would be to disrespect Katia's memory, or at least in my playthrough. This war of mine keeps a bit of distance between the player and what's going on screen. You can only zoom in so much, and even at its closest, the game keeps you far removed from the survivors. On one hand, being back so far from the action removes a lot of the humanity from these characters. We get a much stronger sense of who they are through their little photo and biography updates than we do through what's happening in the game on screen. When something good or something bad happens, it happens to little pixel people who have all the same animations and height, and it's hard not to escape the feeling that it's a bit of a puppet show. These avatars didn't reflect the fully fleshed out characters I carried with me in my head. But that same lack of detail forces us to imagine these characters to get a better view of them. That depressed conversation between Erica and Katia that caused them to fight might just be two low poly models in a text box, but in my head it was as powerful as anything in The Last of Us. I knew that they were talking about Pavle and Bruno and whether it was any use to help anyone in this situation, even if the game didn't make that explicit. And that's the great trick of the game. It plants the seeds of empathy, but you need to fill in the cracks yourself. If you're looking for a rich, textured world dripping with lore about the backstory of the war and who these characters are, you're not going to find it here. Instead, it gives nominal notions about character personalities and the setting, and invites you to commit to caring about them, to make them whole and real for yourself. In The Walking Dead or The Last of Us, characters exist mostly on the screen. Our choices are the only opportunity we get to express who we think they really are. But in this war of mine, the characters exist in your head just as much, if not more, than on the screen, and it gives you a real connection with them. The game wants to create a story with the player, and that means some of the story comes from the game, but a lot of it has to come from you. Not just your gameplay choices, but how much you commit to role-playing and caring about these characters. You can play with a cynical min-max approach to survive until the end of the war, but that removes so much of what makes this game worthwhile. In the end, I don't know if this is really an anti-war game so much as it is a game that tries to get us to think about the horror of war in a context that we don't normally consider it. It doesn't get into the politics of the conflict or whether the war is noble or whether either side is even worth supporting. The war just is, and the important thing isn't to condemn politicians or support the troops, but for survivors to find hope for themselves. The game doesn't rage against the war itself, it rages against the suffering it causes. It wants people to recognize that among war's terrible costs is the disruption to civilian life. It's a perspective too often buried by tales of valor and the ideals and narratives of those fighting. But it's a perspective that needs to be seen, to be, in however inconsequential a way video games can provide it, experienced. And luckily that perspective gets told here with confidence, compassion, and a deft hand.